We had a great question at Wednesday night Bible study the other night about the Sabbath. It was from a person who had not necessarily grown up in the Presbyterian Church and was asking about our practices and our theology of the Lord's Day or the Christian Sabbath. And this person asked, okay, so how exactly are Christians supposed to honor the fourth commandment about remembering the Sabbath day? What are some practical tips that you use or you teach to help us, our family, she asked, to honor the Sabbath day and the Lord's Day? Well, I think that's a great question. It's the very question that I want to get into here in this particular video. Now, Presbyterians, you should know, we have a theology of the Sabbath that's maybe a little bit more distinct from your common kind of generic vanilla evangelical. We actually think as Presbyterians that the Sabbath day or the Lord's Day is something that Christians are still to be honoring. In other words, there are some groups of Christians that don't really teach much about the Lord's Day at all. It's almost as though the 10 Commandments have been reduced to 9 commandments and that the Lord's Day or the Sabbath day is the one that has been jettisoned or disposed of. Well, we who adhere to the Westminster Confession of Faith, especially in the Presbyterian tradition, we do still have a strong theology of the Lord's Day. And in this video, what I want to do is I want to talk about how exactly Christians should and could carry out a Sabbatarian practice without being legalists. Obviously, we don't want to delve into the realm of legalism. Well, we're going to get to that in just a moment. One thing I want to say is my new book is just out. Worshiptainment, the Modern Church's Golden Calf, has been released. I finally got my first copy right here. Some of you guys got your copy ahead of time. We're going to be talking about that in the weeks to come. But we're going to set worshiptainment aside, although there are obviously some connected themes here in honoring the Lord's Day, because in this video, like I said, we're going to talk about the Sabbath. Now, as we get into this, I do want to make one book recommendation besides my own. Here's a really great book about the Sabbath. It's called Worship, Feasting, Rest, and Mercy, The Christian Sabbath by Daniel Howe. I think this is a fantastic book. It's a great short introduction to the Sabbatarian understanding of the Lord's Day for Christians, especially those who come from a Presbyterian tradition. And I'm going to post a link in the description of this video if you want to grab this book. I do think this is going to be very, very helpful. In fact, we might even come back to the title of this book here in just a few minutes, because I think that even the title outlines what Reformed and Presbyterian Christians understand about the Sabbath. That's a pretty good outline right there in the title, Worship, Feasting, Rest, and Mercy. Well, let's do a little bit of theological background here as we delve into this topic. First of all, why is there a Sabbath day or the Lord's Day? Well, it actually goes back all the way to creation. And it's in 6 days that the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and he rested on the seventh day. And so we call this a creation ordinance. It's something that's built into the creation itself. Now, the creation ordinances are those practices, those fundamental building blocks, let's say, of reality that God instilled into the creation even as he is creating it. Okay, so before he ever gave the law on Sinai, there were some things that were observable and should be observed by humanity just because of creation itself. So let me give you a couple of for instances, and then we'll talk more about the Lord's Day. So for instance, work is what we might call a creation ordinance. You'll notice that man, Adam, he is told to tend to the garden even before he falls. Now, obviously, after the fall, work gets harder because the ground produces, thorns and thistles and things like that, and work becomes much more arduous. But the task of serving God practically by way of work is something that's built into the creation itself. So that's a creation ordinance. So too with marriage. Marriage is a creation ordinance. It's good and it's beautiful and it's there before the fall. Now, Adam and Eve, of course, they had a wonderful, beautiful, harmonious relationship in Genesis chapter 2, especially as Adam sings that glorious song to Eve as the Lord is bringing her to him. And then, of course, there's going to be strain in the marriage after the fall, but that notwithstanding, marriage itself is a creation ordinance. So it's also assumed that worship would be a creation ordinance because all of the creation is there. It is designed to glorify and to honor God. And yet, Sabbath observation is also kind of written into the code, let's say, of what the creation is. And so we would say that all true believers should be honoring that day of rest, that Lord's Day of rest, because it harkens back to the fact that we believe in creation. We are creationists. We want to honor the Creator. And just as he rested one day in 7, so also we will rest one day in 7. Now, that command to honor the Lord by way of Sabbath is made more particular and more specific, of course, in the Ten Commandments themselves. And what you're going to notice, especially if you read through the Old Testament and the Deuteronomic law, is that the Sabbath day is one of those things that distinguishes God's people from the pagans around them. So not only is it explicitly tied to the fourth commandment to honor the Sabbath day and to keep it holy, especially by resting, for in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, etc., but all the more important is it to be set apart from the pagans, because as the Israelites are called out of Egypt in the Exodus and delivered into the Promised Land, of course there's some wilderness wandering there included as well, Sabbath observation is one of those key things that distinguishes believers from unbelievers, okay? So not only are believers those who worship Yahweh, the true and living God, the only God, as distinct from all the other pagan gods, the pagan gods of the Egyptians and the Babylonians and all of the ites, the Philistines and the Hittites and whatever. And circumcision, too, is a demarcating sacramental sign on the physical body itself, but Sabbath observation is one of those things that does seem to distinguish God's people from the unbelieving people around them. So there's that. Now, in the New Testament, one of the things that you're going to notice is that the Sabbath in some way becomes the Lord's Day. And this is especially apparent after the resurrection of Christ. Now, if you'll read your Westminster Confession of Faith and your catechisms on the Lord's Day, one of the things that Westminster adhering Reformed Presbyterian Sabbatarians hold, one of the distinctions, is that the Sabbath, the seventh day Sabbath, becomes the first day Lord's Day in the early New Testament church. And I realize that that's controversial, and certainly there are some denominations that hold still to a seventh day Sabbath day, such as the Seventh Day Adventists, as the name suggests. But Reformed Presbyterians, coming from that Puritan tradition of understanding the first day as the Lord's Day now for Christians, we hold this not for any arbitrary reasons, but for three very specific reasons that I want to cover right now. So first, one of the things that we notice in the early church is that Christ himself makes his resurrection appearances to the disciples on the first day of the week. And that's interesting because if you look at the end of the Gospels and in the beginning of the book of Acts, whenever the Lord Jesus Christ appears to his people, whenever he comes to the disciples and he appears and he speaks to them again, he comes to them on the first day of the week. And so there's something suggestive there, we believe, that implies that believers are to meet with their Lord on the first day of the week. So we have that kind of as a exemplar precept, we might say. But even more specifically in the epistles, for instance, in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, Paul is describing what it is that Christians do. They gather together on the first day of the week, and he tells the Corinthians to set apart some of their offerings for the sake of the gathering, the collection. And notice here, also in Acts 20, I believe there's a verse where it begins to suggest that it is the first day of the week that the early Christians are gathering together. Now, we might wonder why that is. Well, certainly there's something like a transitional period, especially after the resurrection of Christ in 33 AD, and then as we come up to the temple's destruction in 70 AD, there does seem to be a period of overlap where perhaps there was a Sabbatarian rest on the seventh day and then early Christian gatherings on the first day of the week. And so you have a little bit of a both-and situation there. But as we begin to pull away from the first generation of Christians, it becomes apparent that the first day of the week, the Lord's Day, is the standard meeting day wherein Christians would gather together and they would worship the Lord and have their praise and their time of preaching, etc. So that seems to be the pattern. By the time we get into the early church fathers, that pattern is pretty clearly established. And it is Constantine, the emperor, who officially declares Sunday, the first day of the week, to be a holiday or a holy day. Of course, Constantine is Christianizing the empire. And so that's why we begin to see that transition between seventh day and first day. Now, let me add one more thing there that perhaps you haven't thought about, and maybe you could disagree with me in the comments. That's fine. I can take it. But as we look at the book of Acts, it becomes very apparent that the Christians are going to have a hard time gathering together at the temple or in the synagogues on the seventh day, and that is because of the violent persecution that they experience as they are literally beaten, mocked, and chased out of the synagogue. So if you look through the Apostle Paul's missionary adventures, his first, second, and third missionary journeys in the book of Acts, one of the things you're going to notice is he goes to the synagogues to preach the gospel to them, but then he is violently chased out. And so that's another reason, a very practical but also theological reason that Christians gather on the first day of the week rather than the seventh day, is because simply they would have been killed had they done otherwise. So they begin to meet on the first day of the week, Resurrection Day. And so if you'll notice, when the early Christians begin to talk about the Lord's Day or the Sabbath or that holy resting, they begin to talk about it as the resurrection day. Still, too, it is the day that we honor creation, yes, but in the resurrection, we are honoring the new creation. And so we might think of the first day of the week as the day in which Christians are called together to worship. Now, let me talk about some practical issues here, and this is where I think we're going to begin to answer the question of the person who asked me a question at Bible study the other day. What should a Christian do to honor the Lord's Day, Resurrection Day, the first day of the week? Well, several things come to mind here. First, obviously, we would strongly hold that you should gather together with the Bible-believing church and worship the Lord in your church worship services, and that goes without saying. But maybe it needs to be said, because sometimes people build other practices into their lives, and especially what I'm going to call those generic evangelical kind of vanilla Christians, where they build other practices into their lives that begin to usurp proper theology of the Lord's Day. So it's all too convenient for them, isn't it, to simply dismiss the fourth commandment as something that's perhaps obsolete, while they're simultaneously taking their kids to soccer games, and they're buying NFL season tickets, and they're boating on the weekends and things like that, which of course is going to draw them away from the gathered worship on the Lord's Day. So that's problematic. Now, I would say this: if your church offers worship services on the Lord's Day, both in the morning and in the evening, then you should probably take advantage of both of those services. Now, here at Gospel Fellowship, just to be honest, we do have evening services, but we don't have them every single Lord's Day. We have them sporadically throughout the summer as we meet in our pavilion for evening worship and potlucks, and we have special missionary features and things like that. And there are other times where we have evening worship, but we don't have it every single Sunday. And primarily that's because just the place that we're at right now, we have multiple services. Our church is growing like crazy, and people are generally exhausted from having to carry out multiple services and then Sunday school and such. So we do have rest as a preeminent theme in our Lord's Days, as I think we probably should. Of course, we have Sunday school too, so that's part of our Sabbatarian practice, is the teaching and instruction, catechism of our children. And then for myself, what we, the Everhards, do is we come home from church. Usually we're dead exhausted, especially I am. I feel like I've been hit by a truck after church on Sundays. But we have a family meal, and then we talk together about what it is that we learned on in our teaching experiences, whether in worship or in Sunday school class. And so my wife will generally make she'll put something in the crock pot so it simmers nice and slow while we're gone, and then by the time we come home, it's perfectly ready. This saves her some of the labor of cooking. Now, I do think that, practically speaking, you should reduce the complexity of your meals on the Lord's Day so that your wife doesn't have to labor too terribly hard. And so that's why we do crock pot. Sometimes we even put it in on Saturday night. You just plug it in on Sunday morning, and then it's ready by the time you come home. So our meals are simplified. I have a good friend that have BLTs every single Sunday because it's real easy. They do it on paper plates. You still have to eat, obviously, on the Lord's Day, even as you're taking your Sabbath rest, but you want to try to reduce the complexity of your life. And so at this family meal, then, basically we start with the youngest and we go through to the next oldest, and then mom, and then dad, and we all talk about what it is that we learned while we were in worship. What was the outline of the sermon? What did the Sunday school teacher teach? Very often the notes from Sunday school class will be produced. The child will read from the notes. They'll give some of the examples that the teacher gave in class. And then, of course, I expect that my own children can practically recite the sermon, not that they would preach it to me again, but that they would at least give me the intro, the order, the main points, and the applications. And in that way, I make sure that my kids have fully taken in what I tried to preach to the congregation. And it would be a great blessing to me if everybody did that. Okay, I think that's great. So there is worship, there is teaching, there is family time, which I think is really important to Lord's Day observation. And then I would strongly suggest that throughout the day, or at least one other sitting, you should have some personal devotion as well. So typically I will do additional Bible readings. I usually do my Bible reading in the morning and in the evening. That's just my habit. Wake up at 5:30, read my Bible, and I also read my Bible before I go to bed at 9:30. And on the Lord's Day, I try to have another devotional period where I'll read some of Scripture, maybe something confessional, or maybe some other good and helpful books in which I find my soul being filled up and helped. And so I think that if you kind of have the three prongs, or the three legs of the stool, that would be gathered worship, that would be family time, family worship, and then personal devotion. I think you're probably doing pretty well at that point. I don't think you need to overcomplicate it, because honestly, on the Lord's Day, I strongly suggest that you work in a great theology of napping. Napping is very good and very important. Remember, part of the reason, part of the why, part of the how that we do Sabbath is actually resting the body. If you are so busy during the Lord's Day, and this is why we don't typically do meetings like church meetings on the Lord's Day, you're missing one of the main points, which is to actually rest your physical frame. Okay, now that goes back to creation, because remember, 6 days we work. I don't do a 5-day work week. I know some of you do. That's fine. But my theology is 6 days of labor and 1 day of rest. So I try to work the other days. Now, for me, even as I have a little bit of a mixed practice, I'll confess, because Monday is my day off, yet nevertheless, the Lord's Day is still the day that I find my soul needs to rest. And so looking again at this outline, I think this is good. Worship, so we gather together for worship. We feast together. We have a good family meal, good family time. We physically rest the body, yes, definitely. And there has to be some times for mercy. Now, somebody's going to ask here, and so I'm going to answer the question right now. Well, okay, so I can't get off of my job on the Lord's Day or the Sabbath day. Okay, well, question, what job do you have? Because there are certain jobs that need to carry on. So police officers have to be available. Somebody's got to be on the fire crew shift. Somebody's got to be working at the hospitals. Somebody's got to be at the nuclear plant, making sure that energy is still running through the city, right? So in our theology, we have what we might call an exception clause, for lack of a better term. And that is that you can do some work on the Lord's Day under two categories: mercy and necessity. Okay, so the necessity would be somebody gets injured, someone's got to come in the ambulance and pick that person up, take them to the hospital and care for them. So yes, there are definitely jobs where necessity is called for. And this is why Jesus talks about, look, if your animal falls into a ditch, you're going to pull them out, right? Obviously. So that would be a work of necessity. There are certain things that have to be done. If you have a farm, your animals still have to be fed. If you have children, you still have to care for them. You can't just set them out into the street, right? So works of necessity means that you can still do the things that you have to do in order to live. We're not asking you to let your world fall apart, okay, in some sort of overt legalism, trying to do absolutely nothing, and then your whole life kind of crumbles apart on that day. No. For safety, for health, for concern, for the sake of your household, there are works of necessity. But as the title of this book suggests, there's also works of mercy. So we think it's perfectly fine to visit widows or care for orphans or do feeding ministries or things like that. Any sort of Christian outreach, I think, is entirely appropriate on the Lord's Day as well, especially as it's caring for those whose needs are rather acute. Okay, so we have exception clauses for that. Works of mercy and necessity. It's in our confessional statements. One thing I would say, though, that I'd be very cautious of is any kind of hobbies that tend to encroach on the Lord's Day. So if you were to read the Westminster Confession of Faith, one of the things that you're going to notice is that we have a stricter understanding of Sabbatarianism than some of the other denominations, like certainly non-denominationals who hardly have a theology of the Lord's Day, but even more so than like Lutherans or Anglicans or such, other Protestants. We do have a pretty strong theology of the Lord's Day, and that even includes entertainment, okay? So the confession says that we should not do entertainments that we might do on other days. Now, what were the Westminster Divines thinking of? Probably things like sport hunting and things like that, which are actually exhausting to the body. And so I would say that you should not hunt on the Lord's Day. I would think that you would not go to NFL football games on the Lord's Day. I'm not saying that the TV isn't on in the background sometimes at the Everhard home, but probably going to an NFL game is going to be more exhausting than it is restful for most people. So I wouldn't do that. I would not fish on the Lord's Day. I would not hunt on the Lord's Day. I would not golf on the Lord's Day. All of that to try to honor that stipulation in the Confession of Faith, which, by the way, I have taken a vow to uphold because I'm Presbyterian and I'm ordained in the PCA. I would try everything I can to avoid those kinds of entertainments that are actually distracting to the heart and to the mind. Because again, let's just look at this outline one more time. Worship is the primary thing. And so anything that's going to become an idol in my life, anything that's going to distract me, I think is probably not a great way to do the Lord's Day. My heart should be fully set apart to the Lord, especially on the Lord's Day. Okay, so I guess that's it for my practicalities. Do I mow my lawn on the Lord's Day? No. What if it really needs to be mowed? Nope, still don't do it. I can do that on Mondays, my day off from work. Because really what I want to try to do is to honor the Lord as best as possible. So let me sum it up by saying this. Your heart needs to Sabbath. Your mind needs to worship. You got to gather together with your families, and you certainly need to let your body rest. The world is too exhausting to do otherwise, and the Sabbath or the Lord's Day is truly a gift for you so that you can recalibrate, rest, and get ready to resume your life again on Monday morning. All right, well, thanks for checking into this video. Don't forget, I'll provide links both to this book right here, Worship, Feasting, Rest, and Mercy, The Christian Sabbath by Daniel Howe, and I will have links to my new book, Worshiptainments, The Modern Church's Golden Calf, in the description. Thanks for checking in. Love you lots. Talk to you later.